Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study of the Little Rock Church of Christ. It's good to see everybody here, and some still coming in. Some visiting, having a good time, and need to find their seats. We're studying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We should finish chapter 7 this evening and get well into chapter 8. Paul's dealing with questions that had been asked. They had challenges, and of course, coming from a very immoral society. Some of them Christians that married to non-Christians, some of them coming from a Jewish background, some from a Gentile background. You've got a complete range of knowledge and backgrounds and customs and understanding of various issues, and how in the world are they going to all join together and be united? And of course the answer is simple. You just put your ideas aside and you do it God's way. Even so, you have to make allowances for the fact that some have backgrounds and their customs that they're used to, and you have to be aware of those differences. And he's dealing with all of these various issues and giving divine wisdom on it. There are some of the points that he makes here about things that we have a liberty to do that we don't do under certain circumstances, in view of brethren who don't know as much as we know. Now, I know people that think that sounds crazy. I know. This is right. I don't care what he thinks. And Paul was saying that's not right. And when you do it the way Paul did it, it's amazing how well it works. We have brethren who see some differences, and they just, their purpose in life is to split it about 4 different ways because they're not lining up with their concepts. What was the result of what Paul did here at Corinth with all of these diverse backgrounds and knowledge, background of knowledge? It wasn't easy, and some of it worked the first letter, and some of it he tended to in the second letter, and he didn't ignore the problem, but he dealt with the problem with divine wisdom. Your ideas don't come close, and it's not your ideas in competition with his ideas. It's our ideas in competition with God. And unless we have made a universe lately, we just don't get a vote. God's the one that knows how to do it, and it's amazing how well it works. We've gone through a series of questions regarding marriage and divorce. And the unique thing about this section, in contrast to the teaching of Christ, was that they've got a totally different audience that in view. Jesus was talking about those who were Jews and just resisted even speaking to those who weren't. In most instances, there were exceptions, but generally speaking, his audience was Jewish. And they were talking about, what does the law say? And he would respond, well, what did Moses tell you? here we're talking about a whole mixture of circumstances, and those married to unbelievers. Now, the question of whether a Christian can appropriately marry an unbeliever is not a simple subject. But the one that we're dealing with here is not really that one. It is what happens, you become a Christian and you're already married to somebody that's an unbeliever, or that appears to be the situation he's dealing with. Then what do you do? Well, it's obvious you stay married. That answers one of the issues that we dealt with briefly, or at least it certainly has a pretty strong implication. The idea that people outside of God's covenant relationship are not subject to the laws of Christ. He's applying it to all. You stay married if they're willing to do that. Of course, you can't regulate those who are not Christians. They're not going to listen to what Paul said anyway. There's no force to the authority of an apostle with somebody who's not a believer. But he is recognizing the marriage and telling them this is a covenant marriage that is to be acknowledged. And of course, when Paul said on Mars Hill that now Jesus commands all men, not just Jews, all men everywhere to repent, that instruction obviously goes wide. If they are sinning, certainly in those principles that they understood in their heart under the old law, they're guilty before God. I think we often do not appreciate the sense of morality and the concept of God's law that Paul's talking about when he says in Romans 2 that it's written in their hearts. That he's talking about the Gentiles. God held accountable to a different standard. He wasn't talking about Sabbath day worship or the Day of Atonement when he sent Jonah to speak to those in Assyria. But he expected those in Assyria to obey the standard that they understood, and they did understand it and did repent. Though not having any knowledge of the Jewish law. We mentioned Abimelech, king of the Philistines, who was more moral in terms of marriage law than Abraham seemed to be. Abraham was a little more liberal with his wife than Abimelech appreciated and rebuked Abraham. This is something we don't really see appreciated. There was a very strong moral law that they understood and were held accountable for. But it's not, of course, according to the standard that Moses gave on Mount Sinai. What we're looking at here in 1 Corinthians 7 is this hodgepodge of circumstances which often Jesus didn't address. But here is another question. If any man thinks he's acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she's past her youth, if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. If he does not, and he does not sin, let her marry. Now, this is not an issue of Christian, non-Christian, but here's, in the context, especially the immediate context here, a few verses just before, he's talking about the present distress. And advice was being given because of the terrible persecution they were under and would be under, and that makes a difference. While you can look forward normally under normal circumstances, to a wonderful relationship between husband and wife when one of them may be killed, one of them may be thrown in prison, and this is going on, and more of it would be. That produces a different circumstance, and it was often in the form of advice from Paul, but these are bad times and you need to recognize that. But he's saying, all right, don't, but you haven't sinned if you do. One thing we see in these verses, on into verse 37, he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, that has authority over his own will, has decided in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. Who has the authority to decide whether this woman who is past her youth can marry or not?
Her father.
I don't know how to read this passage without that just jumping out. It's not appreciated in our society. In fact, it's just it would cause the hair on the back of the neck of a lot of our feminists around to hear something like that. A patriarchal society, well, the father is the one who has the authority. She is under authority under her father's house, and then under authority in her husband's house, in one until the other. Now, we've talked about that before. Jesus was under authority. Men are under authority to those who rule over the congregation. The congregation is under Christ. Everybody is under authority, but just in different relationships. But plainly here, in verse 37, indicates the Father has authority, and he can decide. And he's saying it's a good idea to say no, but she's past her youth, she's really wanting to get married, and the circumstance described earlier involved fervent desire, and if that is there, it's better to marry. And so there are circumstances to consider that would say, yeah, go ahead, even though he says in general it's better not. As he concludes down in verse 38, he who does not give her in marriage would be better. That's, if you can work that out, that's better, but it's not wrong to go ahead. And that's kind of the, it is exactly the tenor that we've seen down through this section. The daughter, if she's past her youth, that's an interesting term. The word translated youth there usually refers to flowers. She's past her bloom. It's the literal picture. Now, I can, if I tried to get specific about that, I would get in a heap of trouble quick. But I think we've got the pictures. There's a difference between the young women, those who are middle-aged, those who are older. It's just, that's the way it is since the fall. And the younger women are the ones who Paul said should get married, and that's a different flavor from what we're hearing here. But he told Timothy he desired the younger widows to marry. They need to get married. There are temptations. There are too many temptations that could be helped by marriage. But here, this one has not been married. She's past her bloom, and so he considers all of the circumstances, her desires, the situation, and Paul says he's right either way. If he says no, he's right. If he says yes, he's right. But he's the one who has the say. And so if he does give his virgin daughter in marriage, he does well. He who does not will do better. It's a summation. All right, anyone have any questions? We have a tradition where the groom goes and asks the father for the bride's hand in marriage. Is there any authority going on there? Not a lot of times. It's just, this is something you do. It's a tradition, like something borrowed, something blue. There's more to it than that. And we can see where that tradition came from, and it's more than tradition. It's the woman is under authority, in spite of the ruffle feathers and people really getting upset when you say that. No questions, comments, additions? Okay. Then in verse 39, we have a passage that has been the object of controversy among some brethren, unfortunately. And it's not as simple, perhaps, as some would think. The wife is bound as long as her husband lives. Now, I think it's instructive to look at the word bound. It's been used earlier in the chapter, and we referred to it. The Dag says to confine a person or thing by various kinds of restraints, to bind, to tie, the binding and imprisoning, to bind someone with chains. A wife is bound. Now, it's also stated with regard to the husband earlier. It sounds like a ball and chain that we hear people joke about, though. In terms of the bond, that's not a joke. That's exactly the way inspiration sees it. A wife, a husband is bound as long as they're alive. The exception to that would be when one puts the other away scripturally. That is, for the reason Jesus specified. Here, the bond is there. It ends at death, and at that point she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So it's not totally to whom she wishes, or at least that's, I think, the natural implication here. The word in the Lord, or the phrase in the Lord, I have to admit, does, in some contexts, not necessarily mean a Christian. When children are to obey their parents in the Lord, that, and together with the parallel of Ephesians, Colossians, you can understand what he's saying is, it's in the Lord for children to obey their parents. That's what the Lord expects. It's not saying the parents have to be Christians for you to obey them. That exception, I didn't look up the percentages, but maybe 10% of close to 100 usages of that phrase. Actually, I don't know that it would be 10%, probably maybe less than that. It is rare, we know that. Normally, it means a Christian. If we go back to verse 22 in this same chapter, he who was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. That's a Christian. That's another way to say a Christian. And most of the time, it's very obvious. Here, he's greeting those from Rome, or at Rome, Greek, Herodian kinsmen, who are in the Lord. Another way to say who are Christians. You're workers in the Lord. They worked hard in the Lord. A choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine. And just one after the other. This is what the phrase almost always means. 1 Thessalonians 5, and I'm by no means looking at all the examples. We request of you, brethren, that you you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord.
So Don,
Yes.
how could you make a distinction when you get in 1 Corinthians that in the Lord is not talking about the widow could only marry a Christian?
That's what the phrase almost always means. Now, I have to say, almost always, and I think it's the context that determines. If we're looking, for example, at Revelation 14, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. Those who are Christians is what he's talking about. And I know of a couple of instances that are exceptions out of maybe 80. And when you look at the context, I'd just say this is what it means unless you've got reason to think otherwise. It would be a reasonable method of interpretation because it almost always means that. Yes, Terry?
Okay, if someone, say if she does marry somebody that's not a Christian, how does she correct the situation?
Well, if she shouldn't be doing that,
I understand that, but she's
but
already done
then
it.
you don't know. Okay, that's a good question.
To me,
Yeah.
either you tell her to divorce them, that's wrong, or it's only sin that can be corrected by somebody else's action or spouse getting baptized, which neither one of them seem like.
That would be the best answer. Teach them.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I think each situation would have to be dealt with directly. My approach was, all right, how is this used and what does it mean? Almost always.
I understand that, I just ask you, how do you correct it, though, if they go in
Yeah.
and do it?
Yeah, and when you, even before the law of Moses, you're seeing the wickedness that began to take over, that developed into what God destroyed with the flood. The daughters of men were, the good guys saw that the women were beautiful and he's married to whoever they want. That's a way to go downhill, and they went downhill to the flood. That's, be careful who you marry. You don't just marry the first pretty one that comes around. Pretty is not always everything you look at. Not to say that good ladies are not pretty.
It sounds like you're dancing around my question.
Yes, I am. And I'm not sure I know the answer directly to that. When people ask me, and he's talking here about widows, I can get back, I'm going to go back to the passage. If her husband is dead, she's free to be married. When I see the advice even before the law of Moses, and of course in the law of Moses they had to marry those who were Jews. There were exceptions that you could see then where some were proselyted into Judaism, like Rahab and Ruth, but they became Jews. So I would have to sit down and deal with the situation individually. I could tell somebody, I know you're wrong, and have the church withdraw from them. That because I know the possibility that word can be used another way. It almost never is. I don't think that's what's being said here, because it almost never is. And because of the context that we see even before the law of Moses. I do know from my experience in preaching the gospel for 60 years that marrying someone not a Christian is dumb.
I'm not debating that point.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's a different statement. But what do you do if you got a marriage? I can't prove that it's wrong. I don't think that's what the passage meant, and I certainly wouldn't do it. And I would advise them not to.
Or you'd be violating your conscience if you did it.
Yes. Yes, when 9 times out of 10 it means this, there's a pretty good chance that's what it meant. And I don't want to be caught in that situation. So it was worth a lot more than those chances. And when I teach, that's what I teach people they ought to do. But to put the foot down and say, I know this is wrong, I can't prove that. So maybe that's as close to an answer as beyond that, I'd have to sit down and talk to the individuals. That solves a lot of problems many, many times.
If it's before the fact.
Before or after, they're a good idea. And of course, the solution, the easiest solution after the fact is teach the person. You'd be surprised how much, what kind of influence a person like that who has married a believer you can have when they see people who are concerned about doing it the way God said do it and what's wise. They haven't seen that before. And it really gets their attention. I'll just tell a story. It's not absolutely directly related, but it's a good illustration. And it's a true story. A woman was married to a non-Christian. I think she became converted after she was married. She was already married. I'd have to check on that to be sure, but they were having problems, big time. And she had come for counseling to a friend of mine, one that I think teaches what the Bible says, and was trying to counsel biblically. Well, what's all this? What's the problem? What's the row? Well, we ended up getting along too well. Well, tell me what's going on specifically. He deal with generics. And well, he would not do what I wanted him to do, and I'd let him know about it. And come to find out, she wasn't behaving as a Christian should be behaving toward her husband when they had disagreements. He was being pretty witchy, and she acknowledged that. And he said, well, you can't go ahead and like that. That's wrong. You've got to repent of that. And when you have sinned against someone, you've sinned against your husband, you need to go to them and ask forgiveness. Now, when you do this, you don't say but or here's why, or you just deal with your sin. You can deal with other things later. You deal with this thing now. cross. But she went back and asked forgiveness for her sin. And literally brought the fellow to his knees. And he said, I'm sorry. And he said, I want to talk to this fellow that's been talking to you because I see change. And we baptized him about 2 weeks later. Not all those stories come out perfectly, but it's amazing when you do it the way God says do it, how well it works. We got way too much situation ethics going on. You need to learn that lesson from Abraham when he was told to sacrifice him. Well, what looks like really doesn't make good sense is not worth anything. It's what God said. And when you do, it's amazing how well it works. Okay. Wish I had more answers, but that's what I got. Anyone else have comments? In my opinion, she's happier if she remains as she is. I think that have the Spirit of God. The advice element was what to do under the circumstances of the persecution, the present distress.
Is your screen still showing up?
It is now. So the thread that is continuing here is because of this present distress, don't get married. But if you do, it's not wrong. If you do it in the Lord, and I think what he's saying there is if they're Christians. All right, now.
You know, a good thought there would be to determine what it takes to be in the Lord. You could start with Romans 6, 1 through 7, and Galatians 3:27.
And I went through.
Get a pretty good idea of how you get into the Lord and what it means to be in the Lord.
Yeah. Almost always.
Well,
That's the problem. I don't think the
and
parents.
I know that there are people always looking for wiggle room also.
Well, but you look at Ephesians, children obey your parents in the Lord. What if the parents are not Christians? That's not what that's talking about. It's in the Lord to obey. So there are exceptions, but that's very exceptional. And it would be very instructive to do as you suggested. Look at these places where that phrase is used, and over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
That's what it means. And I wouldn't bet my soul that's not what it means here.
Yeah, you need to take account of the actions in which you're
Right.
about to engage.
I know beyond any shadow of a doubt that it's very unwise. Some are very tempted. Here's I've got financial problems, and here he's got lots of money, and he's going to take care of me. It's not a good idea.
Well, and we all know examples of where Christians married non-Christians and converted their spouse. But I think all of us, I know personally, I know a lot more that married non-Christians and left the church than the ones that converted their spouses. So it is a treacherous road to go down when you start being unequally yoked, as we're told in 2 Corinthians.
We have a distorted evaluation of that phenomenon. There's some who do convert, and how many? The ones that we see are the ones that did. We don't see the ones that didn't, and they just drift away. I've had some friends who really worked at the statistics to do the research. One did a dissertation on that. just to count the results, it's about 90 to 10.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't look that way to us because we see the ones that work. The 90, most of those we don't see anymore. But that's what happens 90% of the time. It's dumb. Don't do it. Now that's Uncle Don talking. I
Well,
can't.
and I've seen it over the years with the young college students marrying an unbeliever, and the next thing, you know, for a week or two, a month or two, maybe a year, they'll attend services, but before you know it, they're gone.
We like to put the best face on things and look at the positive view, and sometimes we have to peel back the cover and look at the reality.
Yeah.
The truth is, about 90% of the time it doesn't work, which ought not to surprise us when we see what divine wisdom is telling us. There is, well, interesting expression that we have. Let's see if I've got, no, we don't have it right here. He goes on in the next chapter and he's talking about those who are apostles. Do I not have a right to marry in the Lord, to lead about a wife in the Lord like the other apostles, brothers of the Lord? I have the right in the Lord to do this, to marry those who are in the Lord. It's pretty obvious from the structure and the arrangement there, he's talking about somebody who's a Christian. And you put all of that together, you don't have anybody married somebody who's not a Christian with being condoned. So I'm again it. But I have to acknowledge that in this case there is that remote possibility. But why would you have a remote possibility that you rely on when you're talking about your soul? Anyway, that's my view of it. Other comments or questions? Okay, appreciate your questions. Now, we did get through chapter 7. Did I finish all of that? I think I did, yes. No, we had another verse there. Now concerning, I did, okay. Concerning things sacrificed to idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he's not yet known as he ought to know. If anyone loves the Lord, he's known by him. This was one of the circumstances that many there had no background experience with. Others grew up with it. And so the situation looked differently to those with different circumstances. Now, it didn't change reality. Idols didn't become real creatures because of the background or where you came from. It was wrong. But there's some fringe implications in their daily life that they just grew up with, and it was really hard for them to understand this. And brethren need to understand that knowledge doesn't turn on like a light bulb. It grows, it develops as people mature, and they get stronger, and sometimes you need patience. If you're not violating consciences, you back off and let them grow. here, the challenge was to the conscience of the one who was eating meats. And the unique circumstance that we need to know about to appreciate what was going on is that you couldn't eat meat that had been sacrificed to an idol. I mean, in Corinth, that's just, the custom was such was that's, if you bought it at the market, it had been sacrificed to some idol. Now, the ones who know there's no such thing as an idol don't pay any attention to that. So what? But the ones who grew up worshiping idols really had a rough time with that. They're used to coming there and honoring Zeus or some of the others, and they're buying the same meat from the same place that had been sacrificed to the idol that they grew up honoring, and now then they're eating that meat. That was difficult. And they would learn, okay, I shouldn't do that. I'm a Christian now, I'm not going to honor the idol. But there's Joe over there, and he is buying meat right there from the Jupiter booth. And he's a strong Christian, so I guess it must be all. And the fellow goes ahead and does it when his conscience is not clear. And he's influenced to do that by the conduct of a Christian who has knowledge. He doesn't. Well, that's the circumstance that he's dealing with here. And it's one of the more difficult lessons, especially for new converts, to grasp when they're talking about how they behave, how they dress, where they go for entertainment. People are watching you. And you can lead people to do things that would violate their conscience. They're not as clear conscienced about this as you appear to be, and they're led by your example. Well, I don't care. I'm going to do what's right. I don't care what they think. It's not an unusual response. It's wrong. We do care, must care. Christ died for that soul. And you don't harm that soul. You look out for them. Well, I know what's right. Yeah, well, that's the arrogance that he's talking about here. Love goes in a different direction. It looks at those who are weak and helps to build them up, edify them. And if anyone just relying on, I know, here's, especially in matters of judgment, which would be a different circumstance, and business meetings are where you have brethren say, I think this, I think that, and some are going to pound their fist and say, this is the way it ought to be, and figure out some way to connect it with a spiritual issue. If you don't paint the walls this color, you're going to run souls off. If you suppose that you know anything, you don't know anything, is what Paul is saying here. All right, this is an interesting chapter, and we've covered the gist of it, but our time is up this evening. And so we did get out of chapter 7.
Right.
We may be able to do chapter 8 next time, though. I really hope